I've been very, very impressed with the amount of work Mr. Scott Snyder is putting out on behalf of himself and certainly DC Comics and the Absolute Universe and DC All In, really going out of his way to sell this to everybody. He's giving it the hard sell, trying to get the word out that you're going to like this Batman. Not so much the other characters like Superman and Wonder Woman, but the absolute power DC Ultimate Universe, All In special, all that kind of stuff, the one shot, and then obviously Absolute Batman itself. The word on the street, and this is what I've been hearing behind the scenes, is that the initial interest in All In Special #1 and Absolute Batman #1 and Absolute Superman #1 and Absolute, I almost said Ultimate, Absolute Wonder Woman #1 is much lower than anticipated. Kind of explains why he's going out there and giving the hard sell. But he is not the only one out there giving the hard sell. In fact, the comic books media are now demanding that we give Absolute Universe a shot. Of course, I will do that because I have a comic book YouTube channel. I review comic books. That's what I do for a living. So I will certainly be doing that for you and everybody out there. But why do they demand that we give this thing a shot? What are they actually selling here? We've got articles from CBR demanding, Screen Rant, comicbook.com. Noticeably absent is Newsarama, who aren't doing a whole lot of comic book coverage anymore. It's just a little bit. But CBR, I will say, gives the best, most compelling case out there. It feels like the writer really wanted to give unique reasons or real reasons to actually get into this. The Screen Rant one was a little bit more embarrassing. It was just the guy gushing over the fact that he got to talk to DC Comics writers at San Diego Comic-Con, with a couple of quotes here and there, not very convincing. And then the comicbook.com one, despite the headline, is basically just a big-ass interview. So I clipped off the most interesting thing in there. We'll talk about that at the end. But let's hear about why these companies are pushing Absolute Universe so hard and why we should definitely be paying attention and be all in on Absolute Universe. First up, CBR.com, in an article titled Why You Should Be Excited for DC Comics Absolute Universe, states the Absolute continuity is not just another alternate story. It's an entirely new DC universe that could potentially exist alongside the main continuity forever. It's important to realize that this is not just an experiment. It's a rivaling line of comics to both of Marvel's famous Ultimate Universe comics, which also saw fan favorites reimagined in fundamental ways. This is a limitless potential for stories because for the first time in a while, fans will see a DC universe that has no status quo. We got some interesting things in there, some that I think do work in favor of Absolute Universe, but if you're a DC fan, if you've been here for a while, a couple of those other points I don't think actually work in favor of DC Comics for a couple of reasons. First up, stating that this is a new parallel universe that could potentially last forever. You know what else was a new parallel universe that could potentially last forever? All-Star Universe, Earth 1. They've already done this stuff. They've already tried these initiatives multiple times, and they've always abandoned them. Like, they never actually last forever. They don't really have a long-lasting impact. But I will give, this Absolute Universe, it's got a decent name to it. It does have some talent involved. These aren't graphic novels like the Earth one, so it's in a format that people are used to. Scott Snyder is the best-selling Batman writer, probably the last decade. Nick Dragotta is a really good artist. Jason Aaron used to be a good name. So there are at least some exciting names and stuff along with it. But we realize it's an entirely new DC universe. Remember at the end of Dark Knight's Death Metal when they introduced the new construct of like all the multiverses and Elseworlds in the center and Omniverse and this and that? And they literally did nothing with it. So they sell this stuff all the time and never deliver. So to me, sure, that's one of the intriguing aspects of it, but it's not a selling point because they've done it before and haven't delivered so many times. Now, as far as Marvel's Ultimate Universe, certainly there were some artistic changes to some of the characters, and they did tweak things. But if you look at the Ultimate Universe comics, especially, we'll go to the first one because that one has come and went, and we can look at what was the most popular. What was the most popular? Ultimate Spider-Man. Before Miles shows up, what is Ultimate Spider-Man? The most true distilled version of Peter Parker that you can get, basically just replaying the greatest hits for a modern audience, but not with like modern takes, but just playing it out again in a new universe with some twists and turns along the way. When you go and look at the Ultimates from Mark Millar, he didn't make like Captain America like go around with a battle axe. Like he basically stayed true for the most part to the characters. Unfortunately, he did what he did with Hank Pym, but that had already been introduced into the 616, and Hank Pym has never really recovered from slapping his wife, which wasn't supposed to happen. So unfortunately, that's in the Ultimates. But for the most part, those are just really good versions of the Avengers. Maybe with a slight edge on them, but they're pretty true interpretations of what they're doing there. And then if you go to the new Ultimate Universe and what's really working there, Ultimate Spider-Man, what are you getting? Are you getting a radical change from who Peter Parker is? Well, there are changes. He becomes Spider-Man in his 30s. He's already married and he's got his children. But what have Spider-Man fans been clamoring for over a decade at this point? Spider-Man married to Mary Jane with children. So you're actually giving fans, longtime fans, what they wanted in the first place. So I do think there are some conceptual ideas that are similar between Absolute Universe and Ultimate Universe. Marvel is sticking much more on formula with the characters, where DC is diverging to a great degree with the characters, with ideas that normally would have been, Elseworlds ideas, like more edgy takes that wouldn't have proliferated an actual ongoing like universe that was shared in continuity and stuff like that. So I don't think they're exactly apples to apples. It's more like apples to oranges, in my opinion. Now, as far as there not being a status quo to adhere to, that is one of the inherent strengths of it. And that's one of the inherent strengths of the Ultimate Universe, is that you didn't have, 60 years of continuity to adhere to. You could go back and revisit some of those better stories, redefine them a little bit, retell them for a new audience that didn't want to go all the way back to Amazing Fantasy for the Spider-Man story. And that certainly is a draw for Absolute Universe, in something that is a selling point, that it doesn't have the baggage of 80 years of continuity on Batman, to where you've had so many diverging views of the character and stories that maybe don't all coalesce at some point. So I will give them that. That probably does help sell it. Next up from CBR, they stated, readers have already gotten a quick tease about what this will look like in Absolute Batman after Scott Snyder spilled some details in an interview with the Comic Book Podcast. According to Snyder, this depiction of the Caped Crusader is meant to reflect the reality of many young people growing up in the world today, which speaks to how realistic the Absolute Universe could stand to be. Unique approaches such as this will offer completely refreshing takes throughout not just the series, but the entire line. And now we're getting into the territory where things probably aren't going to work out, going to what Scott Snyder himself had said on a recent podcast. This is going to be Batman experiencing what the youth of today experience. Like, how does Scott Snyder know that? He's not 20 years old. He's not 25 years old. He's fucking my age. It's not like his kids are that age either. I think they're actually pretty young. And, it just comes off as the hello, fellow kids type of meme that you always see there. And anytime we see a character that's been around for 30 years, 40 years, 60 years, 80 years, 100 years, reconceptualized for this new modern audience, so the younger people will finally understand them, it kind of always blows up in their faces, because for the most part, the people that are still reading it are the people that were reading it before. It's not like all of a sudden, if you build it, they will come for new readers. When it comes to comic books, it never really has, and it's not really that way for movies or video games and stuff like that either. When you have a character like Batman, a Superman, a Wonder Woman, there are inherent expectations of what the character is and what the stories will be about. And even telling people ahead of time, well, that's not what we're going for here, they're still going to show up and be disappointed. And then the younger people that this Batman is supposed to represent don't even know it exists, because you never actually got the word out to them. And quite frankly, they might not be interested in Batman at this point. You know what I mean? And you're competing with a lot of different other things out there. How realistic it can be, focusing on how young people see the world. I don't think young people see the world in a very realistic manner, to be completely honest. So I think that was kind of funny. I don't think they're very realistic on their approach of how anything really works. But as far as having completely refreshing takes, they're certainly going about this in a different manner than the Ultimate Universe, which we're really replaying a lot of the greatest hits, especially with Spider-Man and some of those other characters. It sounds like they're not going to do that. You're not getting Lex Luthor really in Superman. You're not getting the Joker in the first story arc for Absolute Batman. I imagine he'll show up at some point, but they're trying to create new villains or recontextualize characters that have been around into villains and stuff like that. So you will be getting fresh takes. But we've also had fresh takes on these characters a lot. You know, New 52 provided a lot of fresh takes on characters. And after about 12 months, maybe 15 months, almost all of them were rejected outright by the comic book fans that demanded you fucking undo this. I showed up for the beginning. You promised something cool, which is happening now. And it turned out not to be cool because I actually liked Superman from the beginning. I actually liked this and that. Now, obviously, there were a couple of anomalies out there. I think people did kind of like what they were doing with Batman. Green Lantern was an outlier. Certainly, Aquaman was an outlier. But for the most part, the New 52 was just outright rejected in pretty short order. Now, that is why CBR are demanding that we put some respect on Absolute Universe's name and Scott Snyder. They have the most compelling case. They make a couple of good points, but also some redundant stuff there that can easily be like, hey, I've seen that, done that, and it didn't work out. When it comes to Screen Rant, they had the worst take. It was just the dude, I don't know, whacking off because he got to talk to comic book writers, which I understand is probably exciting for him. Didn't really provide much new information. This is as close as he got to making a point in the Screen Rant article called "You're Not Ready for DC's All-In Initiative." And being at San Diego Comic-Con made me a believer. I've been reading comics for the better part of my life, and as someone who was sorely disappointed by the sweeping changes of the New 52 and its many, many inconsistencies, I'm always ambivalent hearing about giant initiatives, but the more I heard from these DC Comics creators, the more I realized this wasn't a marketing stunt or an attempt to chase new readers. This was a passion project on a scale that's never been seen before, and no one sold that idea better than Josh Williamson. This is what Mr. Williamson said. So the idea was, if we're going to do this, it can't feel like they're separate. It's one story, right? And then we started talking about all of us, like we're all in this together, and we started saying this all the time. We all say it, and that's what it meant from the top down. It wasn't an initiative. It wasn't a reboot. It wasn't a relaunch. It was a moment in time where we were able to say, we're all in this together doing the same thing. Really, really driving home that this is not a reboot. It's not an initiative, even though it is an initiative. You know, it's not a relaunch. It's a moment in time where we're all coming together and with all these things. And if you're disappointed, like this is the thing I don't understand. If you were sorely disappointed in the New 52 and its reimaginings of the characters, how could you get excited for Absolute Universe? It's New 52, but worse. It's taking the characters, bastardizing them, but bastardizing them to another degree. Like throw like, what is it? When you double it, throw a little 2 up on it. And that's the bastardization that you're going to be getting with the characters in comparison to New 52, especially on Superman. Like they're taking a lot of the defining characteristics away from them. So I don't get how going and talking to somebody that maybe you were excited to meet or something makes you just like stop having common sense. But there you go. I personally believe if you were disappointed in New 52, you probably shouldn't even try this because you're probably not going to like it. For the most part, you might like Absolute Batman. Obviously, I've already reviewed it here on the channel. Non-spoiler review, but I did talk about it, and I think a lot of people might actually like that book. But I think a lot of the other stuff is going to be absolute New 52 garbage squared. That's what I meant. Not doubled. I meant squared. Now, as far as this not being a marketing stunt or an attempt to chase new readers, this is just a passion project. Like, grow the fuck up, Tiny Tim. You know what I mean? Like, what are you talking about? This is absolutely a marketing stunt. There's a reason Scott Snyder's out there selling it to everybody. There's a reason I got 3 fucking articles about this all within like a 1-week time frame. There's a reason within 4 days, like 8 people that are supposed to be like influencers in comic books are saying, I read Absolute Batman. It's a fucking marketing attempt. It's an attempt to get new readers or bring readers back. As far as it being a passion project, I know Scott Snyder's been working on it for like 5 or 6 years at the least. And he had actually, I think they had actually pitched it to DC Comics and it was turned down because they didn't need to do it. They're doing it now because they need to do it, because the sales aren't good. They need to do something to jumpstart interest in DC Comics, and that's why we're getting DC all in the Absolute Universe. Don't fucking kid yourself. This isn't the world's largest passion project. The world's largest passion project is The Passion of the Christ by fucking Mel Gibson. He funded the entire thing on his own. Is Scott Snyder paying for all this shit? Absolutely not. Like, get a fucking clue. And with the Josh Wade said, it's a moment in time we're all working together. Yeah, we've had these before. We had a moment in time where everyone was working together under really strong creative leadership. It was called DC Rebirth, and it was fucking abandoned within 18 months. Another reason not to really buy into it. And what were we told for Dawn of DC? We're trying to get back to the essence and the heart of the character by Josh Williamson himself. It happened in a couple of books, but it certainly didn't seem like they were all working together. One voice, like DC do not operate like that. They don't have the infrastructure to even probably operate on that level unless all these writers are just talking to each other on the daily basis behind the scenes with what stories are going to tell and how they're all going to connect. I'm sure that's happening to a degree, but I don't buy that for a second. You're just doing Future State. You're just doing Infinite Frontier. You're just doing Dawn of DC. You're just doing this and that and the New Age of Heroes and everything else that you've abandoned in the last 6 years. You've sold us this stuff so many times, you can't help but to be completely cynical, essentially across the board. They really did need to come up with a better message, like a more cohesive message that really did acknowledge that they fucked up so many times with all their stupid restarts of the last few years. Finally, we got comicbook.com demanding that we put some respect on Snyder's name, but really it's just a big-ass interview, but it's titled, DC's all-in team embraces legacy and fresh ideas to create a bigger and better DC universe. I think maybe this is the most interesting thing Scott Snyder said, but it was a rehash of almost everything else that he's already said. The goal is to celebrate every kind of superhero storytelling at once. I was lucky enough in my decade plus of DC to be part of a couple of really awesome initiatives. One, the New 52, was all about new things and sort of reinventing the heroes from the ground up and inviting in readers that wanted reimaginative takes. Another, Rebirth, was about celebrating this great, incredible tapestry of continuous storytelling that we've had, this epic kind of collective story, possibly in centuries. So each one was a big success, but they had sort of totally different sensibilities. And sometimes during the time I was at DC, it felt like those sort of sensibilities were in conflict. But my belief and the belief of, I think, most creators and editors and everybody there was that if we could do both of those things together at the same time, we'd have an incredible seismic moment and initiative that embraced all kinds of readers. Now, those are lofty, lofty goals. A lot of people have tried to do stuff like that. A lot of people have failed. I would say the closest we've ever got to somebody telling a true classic, awesome story about a character, but also reinventing them at the same time is like Frank Miller on Batman. Because we did get Batman Year One. We got some really good Frank Miller Batman stuff, but we also got, The Dark Knight Returns, and you also got the Killing Joke. So maybe that like 80s era Batman where you had that Elseworld stuff that was that had a hard edge on it that was different than the mainline stuff kind of gets close to that, but they weren't trying to do it at scale, which is essentially what they're trying to do with Absolute Universe, and to try and celebrate every kind of superhero storytelling at once. Like, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. You're trying to make everybody happy all at the same time. And you can't do that, even with the most successful franchises in storytelling. If you go back and look at, let's say, Captain America, The Winter Soldier, I think is widely regarded as the best superhero movie of all time. I think a lot of people, that would be the consensus, not a majority consensus because there's so many out there, but I think The Winter Soldier would be out there. There are people that don't like The Winter Soldier. There are people that think that take on Captain America sucks. So even the best stuff has detractors. You know what I mean? You can't really please everybody if you don't have a comprehensive strategy on what you represent and what you're trying to do, and you're just trying to be everything to everyone. I think you end up turning most people off in the process. Only the most diehard fanatics actually stick around to the end of things of that nature. And he talks about, how Rebirth and New 52 had different sensibilities. And sometimes during the same time, it felt like they were in conflict with each other. Yes, they were. And if you don't know this, they have different audiences. And those audiences come in conflict with each other when they argue over this stuff. And to try and serve up the New 52 in parallel with Rebirth is really just going to make people mad at each other. And I'm not talking like fun, comic book shop arguments that friends have. I'm talking about all this nonsense that you see on social media where everyone takes a side and then they like call each other like the most libelous, insane names in the history of the world. That's what you get when you end up trying to court two audiences that are completely at odds with each other. Like, they're not parallel audiences. They're like the audiences that want to fucking hit each other head on like rams. And this, if it's achieved, would be a seismic moment, but I don't think it's achievable. We've seen people with greater means and resources than Scott Snyder and DC Comics try to achieve that. They tried to achieve exactly what he's talking about in Star Wars. Did that go well? No, you put the audiences in conflict with each other, and they hate each other now more than ever. You courted an audience that didn't really like Star Wars, so you had to make stuff that wasn't Star Wars, but you made it kind of look and sound like Star Wars, but then Star Wars fans rejected it, and now they all hate each other. They try to do the exact same thing in the MCU with phases 5 and 6, or 4, 5, and 6. And what do you have? You have a discombobulated audience, fan base, that absolutely want to murder each other. And I think that's basically what they're courting here, even if they come close to successful. Because I think this weird like utopia, we're all in this together, and kumbaya shit that they're trying to sell here is what it is. We're gonna give something for everybody. Never fucking works. It never works. You end up going lowest common denominator on both sides. You end up with shitty storytelling that doesn't really match up. And then when you try to match up, people are all mad at each other, and it's not going to work out. So I think, I don't know, maybe Mr. Snyder is living on a farm, like a hippie community or something like that, where they've convinced each other that's how the world works. That's not how the world works. Especially when you're talking about mass scale audiences or entertainment that's supposed to be consumed and enjoyed in mass by large numbers of people. I think you have to do something cool. You have to do something innovative. You have to actually have a message that is in unison and clearly speaks to the audience. And trying to talk to multiple audiences at once just, fucking cancels your own message out. It's like when you send out radio waves and they return out of phase with each other by like 180 degrees, and you literally see nothing because they cancel each other out. I like radio signals, if you didn't know that. So there you go. Those are the reasons that CBR, comicbook.com, and Screen Rant are demanding that we put some respect on Absolute Universe's name. I'm still quite skeptical, even though Absolute Batman is certainly better than I anticipated, and I think it's going to be a big hit. I do not think this is indicative of what we're going to be getting in Absolute Superman or even Absolute Wonder Woman or some of these other titles out there. But if you're interested in Absolute Batman, if you haven't watched the video, it's only a few days old, but I will offer it up to you right now. It's right here. Fun stuff here. No spoilers. Just giving you a really good idea about what you can expect.